This week on the Capital Cable, AI ambitions. With us, Grotto, Allen, Cha. All that and much more next on the 107th edition of the Capital Cable. All right, good morning to those of you in DC. Great weather here, by the way, over the last couple of days. Good evening to those of you in Korea. Good day to those of you around the world. Welcome to the 107th installment of the CSIS Capital Cable. I'm Mark Lippert, your host and moderator. This week on the Capital Cable, AI ambitious, and with us, perfectly positioned experts, unbelievable insights, forthcoming, all-star panel to discuss, unpack, unwind, counsel us on a dizzying array of fast-moving developments in this critically important space. Let me go through their bios and welcome them formally to the show. First, I'm going to go with Gregory Allen, who is the director of the AI Center at CSIS. Everybody knows him well from his CSIS work, but they also know him from his government experience, where he was director of the Department of Defense Joint AI Center. And prior to that, he was head of market analysis and competitive strategy at Blue Origin, has an MPP and MBA from Harvard. Gregory, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
All right, excellent. I think you're a repeat offender as well, so we're going to have to move you up. You get access to the repeat guest lounge. It's in Victor's office, so FYI. All right, excellent. And with us, also joining us all the way from Stanford, my alma mater, and I think Victor's son as well, Andrew Grotto. Andrew is a research scholar at the Center for International Security and Cooperation. He was, prior to joining folks in the academic world out of the farm, he was the senior director for cybersecurity in both the Obama and Trump administrations at the National Security Council. He served as senior advisor to the Secretary of Commerce, Penny Pritzker, for technology-related issues, of course. Staff member of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, where he served in various roles there. Scholar at the Center for American Progress, and holds a JD from University of California, Berkeley. How on earth did they ever let you in at Stanford? MPA at Harvard, and of course, a BA from the University of Kentucky. Go Wildcats. Andrew, welcome to the show.
It's great to be back.
All right, excellent. And getting up early with us as well. Also from the West Coast, Victor Cha, notwithstanding his faux AI generated background that makes him look like he's in his stately office in Washington, soon to be Gregory Allen's lounge. Victor, welcome back to the show. Of course, everybody knows Victor well. He runs the geopolitics program at CSIS, Vice Dean Emeritus at Georgetown University, where he's also a distinguished professor there, serving in a range of different academic and administrative capacities. And of course, Bush NSC, Biden Defense Policy Board, and busy racking and stacking for the New York Giants draft selections. Victor, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Mark. Great to be on with Andrew and Greg, and you.
All right. Excellent. Are you going to redraft Saquon Barkley after that Super Bowl performance? Anyway, all right. I can't go down that road. All right. Excellent. All right. Let's get into it. Deadly serious topic. And of course, we do deal with technology on this program. We are not deep into the technology world, but we have with us experts who can go deep. But I'm going to start with broad strokes to give us, I would say, those who watch Korea, Japan more closely from a regional perspective, to give us a functional perspective and a framework in terms of how to think about this. So, Gregory, let me start with you. Those of us who follow this issue, I wouldn't say casually, but not as deep experts as you, have seen a dizzying array of events and a constellation of different, I would say, machinations in this space over the last several months. Can you just catch us up, broad strokes, on what you have seen over the last, I would say 6 months or so, 3 to 6 months, and how should we be thinking about this in terms of a framework, both in terms of domestically and internationally? And Gregory, the floor is yours. And thanks again for coming on the show.
Well, thanks again for having me. the way that I like to think about this is that many of the largest technology companies in the world are making investments that kind of only make sense if you absolutely positively believe the hype about AI in its most extreme forms. So let's just talk about what that hype means and thinking about it in this regard. It was only last year that Sam Altman said that the performance of ChatGPT is, quote, mildly embarrassing at best, right? That's the CEO describing his own product, that its performance is mildly embarrassing at best. Well, this year, in the room with Donald Trump, he announced that he's going to make, in partnership with organizations like SoftBank and NGX, a $500 billion investment in AI. Now, why would you make a $500 billion investment in a product whose performance is mildly embarrassing at best? Seems to be a discontinuity there. And the reason is that the expectations for the future of AI are astonishingly bullish. So everybody, I'm sure, on this show is familiar with Moore's Law, which has pointed out that over many, many decades, the performance of computer chips on a cost equivalent basis has doubled every 2 years or so. Well, AI has its own sort of equivalent phenomena as Moore's Law, and it has to deal with, what is the quality and quantity of training data that is going in, how much compute capacity is being devoted to train and to operationally use AI models, and then finally, how architecturally and algorithmically efficient are you at using those models? Skipping data and just focusing on those latter two, the trend over the past 10 years is that the amount of compute capacity devoted to AI models is increasing 4.5 times per year. The rate of algorithmic and architectural efficiency is increasing by 3 times per year. So that's a cumulative impact of more than 13-fold. So normally what we're used to with Moore's Law, which is still one of the most extraordinary phenomena in the history of the global economy, we're used to 2, 4, 8 kind of exponential growth. But with AI, what everybody is expecting is 13, 169, almost 2,000, and then 30,000, right? And that's the next 5 years of AI performance improvements. So this is what I mean when I say the only way that these $500 billion kind of investments make sense, and OpenAI is by no means alone. Meta has committed to greater than $100 billion capex. Apple has committed to greater than $100 billion capex. Microsoft is committing to $80 billion capex. So all the biggest tech giants in the world are making these bets. And these bets really only make sense if you expect performance to go through the roof. And I'll just tell you, from my own personal experience, the performance has gotten a lot better than last year. I've gone from a situation where I personally did not find AI especially useful in the course of doing my work to now where, I have to understand what it's good for and what it's not good for, but it is useful for my work. And for folks who are in the world of computer programming, everyone I'm talking to basically says that their job has fundamentally changed in the past 5 years, to the point where some of the people who I know, who are some of the most talented programmers on planet Earth, have said that just in the past year, they've gone from they never use AI in the course of doing their work, writing computer programs, to now their job is fundamentally all day, every day, interacting with these AI systems and figuring out how to coax out of them the next stage of performance that they're looking for. So that's just what we've experienced over the past year. And we expect every year to be that compounding growth of radical transformation. And of course, where all of this is headed is one of the most exciting developments in the history of humanity, right? We're talking about AI systems that are delivering expert level performance across a whole host of fields. And while that's extremely exciting for the economy, it also raises geopolitical considerations. When you're looking at major policy movements like the AI chip export controls that the United States has taken upon China, that's because they believe that we're on the cusp of this transformative increase in AI performance, and that that's worth redoing the overall trading relationship between the United States and China, which is what the Biden administration did.
All right, fantastic. Off to a great start here. Let me come to you with a follow-up. First on the Biden piece, I guess it's safe to say, and I had heard the same thing from interlocutors and counterparts, that basically it's the cusp argument. It's now or never, right? You've got to act now because of the exponential growth or rate of acceleration of the technology, right? And if you act in a year, 2 years, 3 years, it's almost too late in a way, right? So that point one. But then to follow, what else is the government doing? You touched on industry, and at the very end teased us with the government. Talk about governments grappling with it. I personally have never, or it's been rare that I've seen issues take Washington, D.C. by storm like AI, but at the same time, also not, there haven't been good answers yet thus far in terms of where to go. So talk to us about that bucket of issues.
So I think on your first point about whether or not we're approaching some critical threshold, I think there is broadly held sense in industry that we are. It used to be the case that executives in technology companies would talk about, human level AI performance as something 50 years away. Then it started to become something that was 20 years away. Then it started to become something that is 10 years away. And now what I'm hearing from folks in industry, people who are working on researching this technology, they think it's very likely that we will cross a threshold of human level artificial intelligence across basically every domain of economically valuable work that human beings currently perform sometime in the next 5 years, potentially in the next 2 to 3 years. So we are really talking about a Manhattan Project kind of a moment. There's a before and an after in human history from the introduction of nuclear weapons. And what folks are thinking is that there's going to be a before and an after kind of a moment for when we reach artificial general intelligence with human level insight. And it's worth pointing out that one of the most valuable tasks that you can devote these types of AI systems to is improving themselves. NVIDIA chips, a good chunk of the NVIDIA chip is actually designed by machine learning. That's been done for many years at this point. But now, in terms of the overall AI algorithmic and model architecture, a lot of that is now being designed by AI systems themselves. And so you can see how you could imagine a runaway acceleration in performance, where in very short order, we go from AI's performance is mildly embarrassing at best to now we have a data center that has 10,000 Albert Einstein level geniuses in it. And they're willing to work on any problem that you want to throw them at. So this is a strategically significant capability. And again, it's the kind of capability that helps you understand why companies might be willing to put $500 billion or $1 trillion of capital expenditure into this technology over just the next 5 years.
Got it. All right. Outstanding. Really helpful insights there. Let's go to Andrew. Andrew, you've been on the sidelines warming up. Stanford band's there, ready to go. It's time to put you in. Really the same questions to you. Just take it any direction you want to off of the first opening intervention and follow-up questions. Andrew, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Coach. So picking up on Gregory's point, I think that being here at Stanford for the past 7 years, I've enjoyed watching this sort of narrative arc around AI really unfold kind of in real time. And one of the most remarkable things, and this never really kind of ceases to impress me about Silicon Valley, is this almost nonchalance about the impact that technology can have on society beyond just the sort of the good stuff, right? The effects on productivity, on innovation, on people's enjoyment of life, especially the geopolitical aspects of it. When I first came out here in 2017, if you put the word China in front of people and ask them to free associate, you'd get words like, market, business partner, investor. Whereas in Washington, D.C., you'd get competitor, FONOPS, South China Sea, adversary. That's changed to some extent, in the last 7 or 8 years. But It hasn't changed nearly as much as you might think, sitting in Washington, D.C. And when it comes to AI, there is still very much a gulf between sort of conventional Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C. Now, what's interesting is when you start to talk to the frontier model developers, I think they get it to a degree that the rest of Silicon Valley does not. They understand Gregory's point about what the geopolitical implications of having 10,000 Einsteins working on a problem might mean when you think about a military adversary having that capability and the United States not, or at least having a military adversary having that capability alongside us. This moment of time, this sort of pre-Manhattan Project, post-Manhattan Project moment that we're in, I think also points to the importance of being realistic and taking a sort of a long strategic view on evaluating export controls. It is way too early to judge the efficacy of export controls. So, this DeepSeek business that people got really spun up about is worth keeping some perspective over. I'll say, on the one hand, I don't want to downplay what DeepSeek accomplished. I mean, the technology is real on many levels. I'm not in the camp though that it marked, a paradigmatic, evolution in AI innovation. That's not to say there weren't some impressive advances in the technology. They have really, really, really smart people. It clearly stands for the proposition that China is going to be a fast follower for the time being when it comes to competition with the U.S. over AI. But they trained that model before the export controls were really in place. Export controls take time to bite. And to Gregory's earlier point about this period of acceleration we find ourselves in, it seems like the export controls landed at the moment when this curve begins its upward slope. If that's true, then there's potential for those controls to really have an impact. I don't know that we know how much impact they will have. Whether those controls landed early enough to buy that lead that Jake Sullivan talked about when he described the U.S. goal as maintaining as large a lead as possible over China. But I don't think there's any question that the controls have had an impact on China. I know this because I hear I talk to Chinese investors. I hear from companies, they complain about them incessantly. That's a sign. DeepSeek has complained about them themselves. And I think we'll probably have a much better idea over the next year or two as we track developments in DeepSeek and other players in the Chinese ecosystem, their innovation track records around these models.
All right, outstanding, Andrew. Let me come to you with a government question, and the question is as follows: China, Trump administration. We've got Gregory referenced the Biden administration controls, right? That's a very interesting theory of the case. I think of landing right when the curve is taking off and starting to get into hockey stick territory. I think that's their theory of the case in the NSC, right? And having worked in industry, been in and around this discussion with them over the past 2-3 years, I think that's exactly their theory. And I think you're right. Like in terms of the empirical evidence, we've got to wait and see, right? It's early days. It reminds me a little bit of the North Korea debate where everybody said, well, the sanctions aren't working. And my comeback was always, we've never had sector-wide sanctions. This is pre-16, right? We finally got sector-wide sanctions. Anyway, so there's an interesting discussion there that has parallels with North Korea. The question that I have for you, though, is the Trump administration on China seems to be, I wouldn't say divided, but still trying to decide which way it wants to go. You have, I would say, to oversimplification, you've got some real mainstream hawks populating in and around the NSC. But you've also got the president himself, who's made a lot of noises about making a big deal with the Chinese, right? And being very, I think, open to negotiations. where does this leave us on this export control AI competition question going forward? Andrew, the floor is yours.
I think it's an unknown. And there's this old saying in Washington, D.C., right? Personnel is policy. I think, that phrase, I think is the hope that many, conservative, China hands hope will come to pass as the dust settles on the transition. It certainly hasn't been the case on Russia, Ukraine, as we've seen. I don't think we know yet. It's a positive sign that the administration hasn't moved hastily to undo anything that the Biden administration has done on export controls. Whether you agree with the controls or not, I think the fact that they're taking some time and perhaps reflecting on them is a sign, at least, that they're not acting out of sort of a rash sense of, well, if Biden did it, it must be dumb, which seems to be, a guide for many other areas of policymaking. So that's positive. The BIS team is, starting to come into a little bit of focus. It's good quality people, but, when you juxtapose, that against the sort of the Doge, chaos machine, right? And the effect it's going to have, on not just on the broader federal enterprise, but on BIS specifically, the Bureau of Industry and Security, the agency within the U.S. government that administers export controls. It's hard to know how, these controls will fare. Just from an administrative standpoint, right? I mean, these are really intricate controls. If you've seen the AI diffusion framework, I mean, it is, even Alan Estevez will admit to you that it is a beast of a regulation, right? It is not a simple, regulatory instrument, and is going to require expertise and time and attention to maintain and sustain, and that requires personnel, experts. And I'm very concerned about BIS's ability to sustain that human capital. So there are a lot of question marks. Inevitably, it does get wrapped up in the broader U.S.-China relationship. I've been saying this, for really since the end of Trump 1, that I'm pretty convinced that Trump would love to cut a grand bargain with China. It's no secret that he views himself as kind of the consummate deal maker. And it's also, I think, pretty apparent that he doesn't really care too much about the specifics of a deal, as long as he feels like he can, the deal sort of, makes him look good politically. I mean, you think about the North Korea deal that he struck in the first term, which wasn't a deal at all, but he felt like he could claim credit for it. And then his ability to sell a deal, is pretty unparalleled in recent American political history. And even if the contours are questionable, again, consider the North Korea deal he struck. So I always thought maybe this would be a second half of the first administration of this term gambit, but who knows? Maybe he'll try to cut a deal with Xi. And I'm told that when Biden met with Xi in San Francisco a couple of years ago, Xi spent 25% of the conversation complaining about the export controls. And so you better believe that if Xi and Trump are going to cut a deal, the export controls are going to be a big part of that arrangement.
Gotcha. No, that's it. You got to the point that I was going to ask you about export controls being on the table. Outstanding. Thanks, Andrew. Just quick follow-up to Gregory. Gregory, anything to add here on this government bucket of issues, export controls and or overall disposition of the Trump administration vis-a-vis Biden policies towards China?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing that's worth noting here is that it is the first Trump administration that got us started on this adventure of export controls on advanced semiconductors and export controls on advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment. This dates back to the ZTE entity listing of April 2018 and the Huawei entity listing of 2019 and 2020 and the SMIC entity listing of 2020. And perhaps the most significant export controls from a long-term strategic perspective, which is the restriction of EUV, extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, to China. That was done as a result of negotiations between the first Trump administration and the Dutch government. So what the Biden administration effectively did is double down on all of the Trump administration's policies and also try to identify some of the critical failure modes of that policy and adapt it, and then finally to extend it to a focus on AI. So one big change that it did was moving from a model that is principally based on end user and end use type restrictions to more countrywide type restrictions, with the acknowledgement that if you sell it to one person in China and say, please don't sell it to this other person, well, there's a decent chance that that other person is ultimately going to get access to it. And so moving towards a more countrywide centric model for export controls is prioritizing efficacy over optics. There's a big difference in this world between looking tough and actually being tough on China. The second thing I would add is that the Biden administration's final policies on AI did not just include export controls. They also included a massive executive order at the intersection of AI and energy policy. Specifically, the Biden administration's AI and energy executive order waives many environmental regulations and offers a number of benefits to folks who are looking to construct massive data center and electrical generation infrastructure when they do so on federal land, and thereby avoid the thorny regulatory network that state and local type regulations present in this world. The Trump administration, I recall, during the Trump campaign, almost any time Donald Trump was asked a question about artificial intelligence, no matter what subtopic it concerned, he would pivot the conversation to AI and energy. It's clear that he is really interested and personally engaged by this topic. So I think they're going to take a hard look at that Biden administration AI and energy executive order and ask themselves what they could do to make it even more ambitious, to make it even more aggressive when it comes to accelerating the big build out of AI infrastructure in the United States.
Well, I'll add maybe add a more cynical take on that, which is I think they will look at it and say, how can Trump claim credit for it?
All right. Well, Rorschach test on where you stand, right? Ambition versus credit, maybe two different sides of the same coin. All right. Outstanding. Thanks, Andrew. Good comeback there. Gregory, thanks. Outstanding intervention. Victor, over to you. You've heard this really interesting discussion. Thoughts on the discussion, number one, and number two, brought it a little bit to the allies. The Koreans have taken some actions here. How should our friends in Seoul, Tokyo, even Canberra be thinking about this? Victor, floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Mark. Really a fascinating conversation. I'm really a student more than a participant on today's shows, but that's not going to stop me from making three quick points. The first is in terms of the AI export controls in this whole question of whether sanctions do or don't work. Mark, you referenced the same discussion on North Korea. The way I like to put it is, for critics of sanctions, or in this case AI export controls, these things don't work until they do, right? And we often forget that. And sometimes we don't know when people say, what does success mean? It's one of these things where you know it when you see it, but it's hard to describe what it actually means in advance, particularly on such a complicated issue as AI export controls. The second point I want to make is, as we all know well, South Korea has always sought exemptions from some of these controls. And the added point I would make here as the only political scientist in the room is that we can't discount how the domestic political crisis, and in particular the economic fallout from the domestic political crisis, could push South Korea in ways to be even more aggressive in terms of seeking exemptions or seeking to increase semiconductor exports to countries like China. What people often forget is that South Korea was able to recover from the previous two impeachment crises. Economically, they were able to recover economically because of, in the first case in 2004, because of China's double-digit economic growth. But then in 2017, it was because of, that was like their bumper years in terms of semiconductor exports. And that's what, that was very important, enabling them to say the political crisis didn't damage the economy too much. They don't have Chinese double-digit economic growth this time. Instead, they have wars, they have tariffs, Trump tariffs, and so that puts a lot of pressure on semiconductor exports. So I think there's a political dynamic there. And it doesn't just apply to export controls to China. I think it also applies to economic relations with Russia. I think on the one hand, South Korea has tried very hard to join with the international community in these sanctions on Russia. At the same time, though, if, Zelensky's coming to Washington, tomorrow? It'll be like step 2 in getting to this Ukraine peace ceasefire deal. If that happens, a big part of that is going to be normalizing commercial and economic relations with Russia. And again, I think South Korea, although they were working with the good guys, will be one of the first to want to normalize economic relations with Russia because of the economic fallout from the domestic political crisis in Korea. I think the Korean government just recently announced that they're going to actually, as part of some announcement on export controls, which included quantum and AI, they also talked about increasing humanitarian exports to Russia. So that's like the first smoke signal that that's the direction in which they're headed. Finally, on Trump and the questions that you asked Andrew and Greg about Trump and like how he thinks about the Biden at the conclusion of the Biden administration, these AI export controls. To me, it's Trump, right? So everything is negotiable, right? Everything is negotiable, and so to me, the real question is whether Trump looks at these AI export controls and really sees them in terms of maintaining chip dominance, or whether he just sees it as a negotiating chip. If you like my play on words there, Mark, did you like that? Did you get that?
It did.
It took me all of the conversation between Andrew and Greg to figure that one out. But
it was a long windup, but the pitch landed. Right?
Yeah.
So there you go. It was right there on the outside corner.
Yeah. But Andrew could speak to this, but my sense on China is that like Trump is not necessarily like a chip hawk on China. I don't think he's even a security hawk on China. I mean, the main thing he is a merchandise trade hawk on China. That trade deficit just drives him nuts. And so I agree. Like there is real potential for some sort of deal that that really upsets the apple cart on this particular issue, and could upset the apple cart on other issues like Taiwan. Everything and anything really is negotiable. And I could be wrong, but I don't sense like a deep conviction on the part of Trump that AI export controls are sort of the third rail. He's not going to touch that because he sees that as as important as opposed to just as leverage and an instrument that he can use on China to try to get to this trade deal that he completely failed at getting yet in the first term. But who knows?
All right, outstanding, Victor. No, let me come back on a couple of your points because really I think it added a lot to the discussion here. First, what I would say on the export controls, they work until they don't. The hard thing to judge is the temporal nature of them, right? Because they're so difficult, and the effect over time, right, is cumulative. And we've talked about that in the North Korea context, right? So people who get up, and it dovetails with Andrew's points, who declare them ineffective in 3 months. There's just a temporal component. But then the dilemma for policymakers is how long And are they is this the juice worth the squeeze over time? I think that's a very interesting discussion that we've touched on here. The second, I would say, on the Russia-South Korea axis, not axis, rather, I guess you'd say possible re-engagement economically, noting that the South Koreans have been very good allies with Washington on this. The interesting thing is, what will the Russian market look like after this, right? In terms of, who's been in there for all these years is the Chinese companies, right? Gobbling up market share previously held, especially on consumer products but not limited to, held by Korean and Japanese companies hitherto. So I think that's an interesting dynamic on what's on the other side. On your political, economic, the domestic political turmoil, economic discussion, I want to underscore a point that you have made several times on this show, in that, in addition to the other factors you lay out, this is the moment you need a head of government, head of state the most, right? Yeah. To come into Washington, get the head-to-head negotiations, top-to-top negotiations, and cut those deals, or at least pave the way for deals. And, there was a big Korean business delegation here recently, I think last week, right, to try to fill that space. But it's still a very, very important component. And I think I was just in Korea. I think people are concerned about that issue in the political context, and it's deja vu all over it, right? Just like 1617 as well. So I think really and really good discussion there. And just to add one other thing, and on the tariffs piece, you have possible tariffs on Korean steel, right, at 25%. So you have tariffs, no head of government. It's a very different situation, Victor, and I think you're right to underscore it. All right, we've got 3 minutes left. Outstanding discussion. I'm just coming to folks for final comments. I mean, we're here at the end already, so I'm going to just ask Gregory to have any insights that we've left off the table that you want to bring up in the waning moments of a really, really dynamic capital cable here.
Sure. I'd like to conclude by responding to something that Victor said, which is that the Trump administration is looking to make a deal and everything is on the table. I think based on the evidence that we saw from the first Trump administration, in which the ZTE export controls demonstrated extraordinary strategic value and leverage that was traded away for far less than it was worth, I can see why you would make that claim. I believe it's different this time around. Having engaged with folks in the Trump National Security Council, having engaged with knowing the list of people who are going into the Department of Commerce to run export control policy, and just recognizing the conversation in Washington that Donald Trump is ultimately going to hear about, I think there is recognition on the strategic value of semiconductors and that it is not worth the same as soybeans on a strategic basis. And then what I hope reaches the Trump administration is how useless any kind of grand bargain is going to be. What I mean by that is that the Chinese government is absolutely committed to self-sufficiency on this industry. And there is no deal that we are going to make that is going to persuade them away from that. The way I like to think about this is, imagine if hypothetically we decided to start selling nuclear submarines to China. And do you think that China would shut down its own domestic nuclear submarine industry just because we started selling them to it? No. Of course, they would buy American submarines because they're amazing, but they would immediately get to work reverse engineering them, transferring that technology to domestic industry, because that's what it looks like when you have a really strategic technology. Well, on areas like semiconductor manufacturing equipment, AI chips, this entire sector that we've been talking about, it is astonishingly strategically significant. And there is no deal that we could possibly strike with China that is going to persuade them that they should do anything other than get off of foreign technology as fast as they possibly can.
All right, outstanding. Let me just add one thing to it. It's very interesting. I had a conversation. I don't want to reveal who because I'm not sure if he wants me to quote him, but a leading China expert. And he basically made a point similar to yours, Gregory, which is he thought in some ways the geopolitical elements would be easier to trade than the geoeconomics, right? In other words, Ukraine, Taiwan, things of that nature, right? South China Sea, and that the geoeconomics, and it's a slightly different take in that the Trump commitment to domestic manufacturing and certain critical technologies puts real structural constraints to any landing zone on a negotiation in the geoeconomic space. But anyway, interesting stuff there. I didn't think of that idea. I can't take credit for it, but I do what I do best: parrot other people who are a lot smarter than me. All right, Andrew, over to you after Gregory's great intervention.
Great. Yeah. So I have no doubt that the senior people who are going in and are in the Trump administration are China hawks. I'll just observe that Rubio and Waltz were vehement Russia hawks until about 2 weeks ago.
Fair. Well, it's also it goes to your point. Personnel is policy, and I guess
until it's not.
But the override. Well, I was going to say the overriding Moore's law piece of that is until it runs into the person with the election certificate on the wall, right? So I think that's the issue, right? So that we're running into. It's an interesting one. I think it gets to Victor's point where, yes, the personnel is different this time, and the personnel is very hawkish on some of these things. But at the same time, there's the president. And the president has a big say in this matter. Let me put it that way. Okay. Thanks, Andrew. Good stuff there. Victor, final word to you. You've stirred up a great conversation here. I just wish we had more time, but we can't afford it. John Hamre's going to send us a bill, and we can't pay that bill. At least not me.
Yeah. No, we're paying by the minute for the studio, so yeah. So I hope that Greg is right, and I have no doubt that the people who are staffing this administration are all people who hold that sort of view with regard to the geoeconomic aspect of this. I have no doubt. But as as we've all said, they're all the right people who will say the right things, advocate the right things, push the right things up the interagency policy chain. But we know that Trump administrations are not bottom up; they're all top down. And so the right people and they matter until they don't, as Andrew said.
All right, outstanding. It just harkens back to me to one final thing. This whole discussion. It wasn't too long ago. I'm at least old enough to remember this quote in college, which was Boskin, the top economic advisor to H.W. Bush. It doesn't matter what we make, potato chips or computer chips. We're a long way from that right here in Washington. It's, I think, in a relatively short time, and it gets back to the point that some were making about is this a pre-Manhattan Manhattan Project moment or a post-Manhattan Project moment. So let me end it there. So thanks everybody to just an outstanding episode. We got to have this group back, and we got to have more time next time. Really appreciate it. Andrew, thank you for waking up early with us. Gregory, as always, thank you for joining and really contributing to an outstanding discussion. Victor, thanks for waking up early in LA. I know you were up at 4 doing about 1,000 burpees to get in shape for your tennis. So you're already up and going anyway. So we'll see everybody in 2 weeks. And we're less than a month to the opening of KBO, March 22nd, earliest KBO opening day in the history of the league. All right. See everybody in 2 weeks. Goodbye.
Thanks. Guys.